The Nogun-ri Massacre occurred on July 26, 1950, near a small village in South Korea during the early stages of the Korean War. Just a month after the start of the war, a large number of South Korean refugees were slaughtered by multiple US air and ground attacks in a span of 3 days. According to the South Korean government, an estimated 163 people were killed or missing, while according to the survivors of the massacre themselves, around 400 were killed, mostly consisting of women and children. Countless more were left wounded and scarred. This incident was unknown to the world for several decades. The US Army denied and rejected the survivors' claims until 1999 after multiple investigations were launched. And only until 2001 did they finally acknowledge that the killings happened, but they still rejected the survivors' requests for apology and compensation. Why did this massacre take place? Why did the US Army order its troops to slaughter hundreds of South Korean civilians, whom they were supposed to protect? The Korean War first broke out on June 25, 1950, a month earlier, when North Korean forces crossed the border into South Korea and began engaging in combat. Following the end of World War II, Korea had been divided into two states at the 38th parallel line, with the socialist North Korea being backed by the Soviet Union and the capitalist South Korea being backed by the United States. In response to the invasion, the United Nations authorized a military force to repel the North Koreans. Thus, American troops were deployed immediately to Korea to fight alongside the South Koreans. However, the American troops were insufficiently trained, especially in dealing with civilians, and were led by inexperienced officers as well. In July, US and South Korean troops were already forced on the retreat, with several villages already captured by the North Koreans. An estimated 380,000 South Korean refugees were displaced and forced to flee south towards US lines. But according to reports circulating within the US Army at the time, there were also supposedly disguised North Koreans among the groups of refugees. Orders were issued to fire upon civilians in the front lines to stop the so-called enemy agents. These orders were only discovered to the public decades later in declassified military archives. On July 25th, a group of around 600 South Korean villagers were being evacuated by US troops. 7 of them were killed by the soldiers during the night, after straying too far from the group. The next morning, on July 26th, the soldiers had already left, and the refugees continued making their way south. Near the village of Nogun-ri, the refugees were stopped one last time by US soldiers at a roadblock next to a railway, where they were searched and stripped of knives and other belongings. As the refugees were resting alongside the railway, US aircraft suddenly strafed and bombed them, with aircraft coming back and forth repeatedly to keep attacking. US soldiers on the ground then suddenly reappeared and began shooting the wounded on the tracks, finishing them off. Refugees were forced to take shelter inside a double tunnel underneath the railroad bridge. There, they came under non-stop machine gun fire from US forces on both sides of the bridge. According to survivor Park Sun-young, who lost her 4-year-old son and 2-year-old daughter in the attack, children were screaming in fear and adults were praying for their lives, and the whole time they never stopped shooting. Trapped refugees were forced to pile up corpses as barricades and dig into the ground to hide for safety. Some survivors were so overcome by thirst that they had to drink blood-filled water from a stream underneath the bridge just to survive. The massacre continued non-stop for the next few days, with US soldiers making sure to finish off any survivors they found. Finally, on the early morning of July 29th, the US Army's 7th Cavalry Regiment withdrew from the area. The massacre was not reported in official unit documents afterwards. North Korean soldiers later that afternoon arrived in Nogun-ri, and helped the 24 remaining survivors, who were mostly children. According to official South Korean government reports, 150 were dead, 13 were missing, and 55 were wounded, some of whom later died of those wounds. Of those victims, 70% were women and children, and men over the age of 61, while 41% of those were children under the age of 15. The survivors today claim that 400 were killed. For the next several decades, the survivors were afraid to even tell the story due to fears of official retaliation and warnings from the South Korean police to stop telling others about the massacre. They were forced to keep this to themselves. The US Army denied that such an event occurred until the Associated Press launched an investigation in 1999, which interviewed several Korean War veterans of the 7th Cavalry Regiment who were directly involved and confirmed that they were ordered to kill the civilians. The Army was forced to conduct its own investigation in 2001 and finally acknowledged the slaughter, except describing it as an unfortunate tragedy inherent to war and not a deliberate killing. The Nogun-ri survivors' requests for apology and compensation were later denied. The US Army refused to open any further investigations after 2001. In the end, no soldiers were ever prosecuted for this massacre. The victims and their loved ones to this day still strive for justice and recognition. To this day, they still hold conferences and ceremonies to not only memorialize the innocent lives lost in this tragedy, but to also make sure that the world never forgets their story. This is what was done.